Hello, America. Just checking the blood pressure again. I figure if I'm going to die of a heart attack, I should probably do it soon. You know, or at least I'm not going to get sick, because, you know, that whole healthcare thing. There's no hot list tonight, because I just have to show you another chart that's going to make your blood pressure go through. Goldman Sachs just posted higher than expected quarterly earnings of $3.44 billion, up 65%, even though they took over $10 billion in government aid, which, of course, they were finally allowed to pay back last month. No one is protesting the compensation packages that that were averaging now about $770,000 for each of their 29,400 employees, with top executives gaining millions of dollars. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, former CEO of Goldman Sachs, this is how it happened. This is how it all started. He was the former head of Goldman Sachs, and then, of course, George W. Bush, he made him Treasury Secretary. Nothing wrong with that. Goldman Sachs, hire a lot of great people, blah-de-blah-de-blah-de. Well, what is the first thing that he does? The first thing when we go into this crisis is he lets Bear Stearns fail. That was one of the big competitors of Goldman Sachs. Then he lets Fannie and Freddie, and he says, oh, we can't let them fail. We got to bring them in. But then he says Lehman Brothers, which is the biggest competitor of Goldman Sachs, let them fail. Okay, so the former Goldman Sachs CEO, now Treasury, lets two companies fail. The one company, which was one of their competitors, and then the second one was the biggest competitor. Then they decide the very next day after Lehman, geez, should we let AIG fail? Well, they had a big conference, and the only one that was in the room that was a banker, trying to help Hank Paulson out, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs. In the room with him was a guy named Lloyd Blankfein. He's the chief executive officer and the chairman of Goldman Sachs. Well, they decided, yes, you should bail out AIG. So AIG, they bail out the day after they let their competitors go out. They bail out AIG to the tune of $85 billion. These two geniuses, both from Goldman Sachs, say, yeah, you got to do that for the economy. So who's the biggest single payout from AIG? What a surprise. On the check, make it out to Goldman Sachs for $12.9 billion. Now, the Treasury Secretary again, Hank Paulson, remember, Goldman Sachs CEO, he decides he needs somebody to head up TARP, somebody to, make sure he can figure it out. Who do I know? There was this guy at Goldman Sachs, Neil Kashkari. He decides he's going to appoint to oversee TARP Neil Kashkari. He changes, one of the first things he does is Goldman Sachs got to be changed to a bank holding company. Why? Well, that way they can have access to TARP, FDIC money, get money from the Fed in the discount window. That way they can be saved. Right. So Kashkari, after he makes this decision, he's out. I mean, he's still in the system, but he's out. He's been replaced now by Gary Gensler. What a surprise. Gary is a former partner at Goldman Sachs. Now, once Kashkari has made Goldman Sachs a bank holding company, they don't have that pesky SEC thing, to look them over. Instead, no, they have a guy named Stephen Friedman. He was the former chairman of Goldman Sachs, now overseeing them, because Stephen is at the Fed. Used to be at Goldman Sachs, but not now. Well, Stephen wasn't actually just used to be at Goldman Sachs. He actually had an awful lot of stock, even though he was overseeing Goldman Sachs, and he was on the board of directors. Well, that's a conflict of interest. Well, you can't do that unless Timothy Geithner comes in to the rescue. Timothy Geithner, please, can we have Stephen, who's on the board of directors, oversee Goldman Sachs? Huh? Sure, of course. Timothy Geithner says, absolutely. Sure, we can do that. He gives him a temporary one-year waiver of the rule, which, by the way, just, meant that he could not only hold the shares, but this one was also that you could serve on the board of directors. Oh, and also, Mr. Friedman can also now stay on the board and buy an additional 52,000 shares of Goldman Sachs. In the meantime, he makes $3 million. Now, just so you know, Goldman Sachs, they've learned their lesson. I mean, look at them. They're profitable now. Sure, they took all this money and they took this money over here. Sure, they took your money. They paid it back, through TARP. But this was their money from AIG. That was, and they've learned their lesson. No more derivatives, no those CDOs or anything like that. They're not going to really be doing oil speculation as much as they were, I'm sure, but they have a new derivative. It's called the Green Environment. They have just purchased 10% of the Chicago Climate Exchange and $1 billion of carbon assets. That's fantastic. They're endorsing mandatory limits on carbon emissions, $23 million to buy that 10%. Gee. 12, so about half of what we gave them through AIG. $1 billion in carbon assets, such as alternative energy projects, and they're lobbying hard for that cap and trade, which is going to be oh so good for you, the small businessman. Oh, and there's two more things here in this web of bubbles. They've hired a new lobbyist for Goldman Sachs. He's Michael Pease. He's joining Director of the Government Affairs. Yeah. And they actually hired him. They had to hire him because this guy left. Mark Patterson, he was a Goldman Sachs lobbyist, and now he's just been moved to the chief of staff for, there he is, Timothy Geithner. So we got Goldman Sachs now because Tim's not really a Goldman man. And Michael Pease, yeah, we found him in Barney Frank's office. Everything's fixed. Can I ask you a question? Do you think that there's anyone out there without an agenda in Washington, D.C.? Can we find anyone who just says, I want to fix the problem? I'm not part of the web. Somebody without a conflict of interest. We are being spun in a web of lies, and we are caught up in this web. But don't worry. People will tell you over and over again, oh, we've survived worse. No, we haven't.